All right, so Southwest Baptist University is our last contestant today, and they had this question. The National Bureau of Economic Research has indicated that without substantial intervention, the U.S. would be unable to compete with China in the global semiconductor market. The President has charged you with developing a trade policy that ensures that the U.S. will have access to the semiconductor development and production for reasons of national security. What interventions, or mix of interventions, would you recommend to the President that accomplish this goal while doing the least amount of damage to the economy as a whole? The floor is yours.
So one of my favorite memories in elementary school was trading snacks in the lunchroom. My mom always packed me these like healthy snacks like apples and stuff, but I wanted the Oreos. So what did I do is I would trade up to what I wanted. And we see that one of my fondest memories is this one kid who was a bully to me. And so me and my friends got together and we decided that we weren't going to trade with him because he was being a bully. And this leads to today's question about China taking control of this global semiconductor market. And what interventions can the United States take to have a comparative advantage in this race? And we're going to look at this through three different ways. First, we're going to look at the philosophical interest of national security. How can we benefit America as a whole? And then secondly, we're going to look at the economical impact of bringing China to the table. And then lastly, we're going to look at how are we going to implement this exactly? What we're going to do, just to give you a little rundown, is we're going to get into putting on a tariff on China. And just China, we're going to open up the trade to Taiwan, India, Japan, South Korea, these types of countries, to force China to the table.
From the philosophical perspective, I think we need to look at this from the words of the very founder of free markets himself, Adam Smith. And so in Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments, we see he establishes this idea that the entire economic system of free markets and capitalism is based off of the philosophical human element of self-interest. This trait dominates all human interaction with one another and the way that we go about living our lives. And an anecdote that he uses in his book is he describes how we can often see a tragedy that'll happen overseas, like maybe an earthquake that kills hundreds of people in the Philippines. And then we'll be concerned about it for a night, and then the next day we'll wake up and forget about it. But then if we get a blister on our toe, God forbid, we'll be thinking about that all night, and then in the morning we'll be running to the doctor and about have a heart attack over that, right? It describes an inconsistency in human nature. It describes that we need self-interest to have as the central underpinning for all interactions with other states. The United States also must pursue its self-interest of national security interest above all else. And so, of course, there's that quote from Benjamin Franklin that those that sacrifice liberty for the pursuit of security deserve neither. But then I would also remind you of the quote from JFK where he says that domestic policy can only harm us, foreign policy can kill us all. It is in the U.S.'s national security self-interest, according to Adam Smith's principles laid out in Theory of Moral Sentiments, to pursue a national security strategy which, on the one hand, strengthens the U.S. domestic industry in the case of a war or other conflict where we have semiconductor capacity, but also strengthens our pan-Pacific allies, like Japan, like South Korea, like India, in the event of an emergency or in a conflict, that they would also be strengthened. So we have allies in the event of further deterioration of relations with China to enable the self-interest and enable the United States to emerge as the major power player in the pan-Pacific region.
And it's often cited that tariffs are going to be anti-free trade. And I want to make this clear that we are not anti-free trade. As we look at this from an economic angle, we are for equitable free trade that can benefit the US society, give us a comparative advantage in the semiconductor race with China. Now, even our handout, which is so pro-free trade, does give mention that tariffs can be beneficial. Even Hazlitt argues that it's useless to deny that a tariff cannot be beneficial in cases of special interest. And that's the principle that undergirds our whole argument, is that this is a case of special interest. The semiconductor race is, again, vitally important to national security. So as we're looking at this, what we're going to impose upon China is in the US's best interest, as well as the interests of the US allies that are going to directly benefit from our free trade. Again, we are forcing China to come to the table, as Hunter pointed out. If all of the other countries around China, are still in free trade with the United States, but China is forced onto a tariff, say 50%, then we have the economic upper hand over China without damaging the US economy and bringing benefit to all other countries except for China, who is not playing by the rules to begin with. This is a fair punishment on China, who is not playing by the rules of international trade. And this would benefit countries, the entire South Asian bloc, or Southeast Asian bloc, except for China, that being Taiwan, India, Korea. These would be import and export tariffs on all materials, on semiconductors and raw materials required to create semiconductors. The goal would be to push all other countries to agree to these, as Ethan will argue for in a moment. And again, you could say, again, we're covering all of our bases in terms of protecting our national security while also giving as much free trade as is possible while trying to maintain national security, because it is that balance. And again, we're still following the principles of Say's law, where the argument is that what's good for your neighbors is good for you. If you have rich neighbors, then you are benefiting, because all of the neighbors, except for China, who is that bully, like Hunter mentioned, who is being iced out and forced to come to the table to play by international rules. We are benefiting all ourselves and our other neighbors, except for China, who, in the long run, will be forced to come to the table. So next we have Ethan with policy and actual implementation.
So this seems like somewhat of a dire and intimidating situation, but thankfully there is a roughly easy fix to that, and that would be a simple executive order levying a 50% tariff on China's semiconductor industries. And this is something derived from the IEPA Act, which is the President's Emergency Economic Power Act. This is a power the President already has. It's subject to judicial review and congressional oversight, but given the important ramifications of the situation, I think it would be something that Congress would be able to unify around supporting, especially if this is a brief situation meant to bring China to the table to teach them a brief lesson, while again, we are looking at increasing trade with neighboring countries in the Asian region. We're still engaging in free trade with countries like Japan, India, and South Korea. We're still trying to maintain that those industries' access to the United States, those providers here in our country, trading with the providers in that country and the consumers in those countries. We hope to hold the rate steady in those areas while just briefly kind of impacting China in that way. Signing a 50% tariff on China's semiconductor industry should have immediate global ramifications. This impacts stock markets pretty immediately. And even though China and the United States do talk aggressively when major industries, when things as important to national security as these products are impacted, deals can be reached pretty quickly. People are going to come to the table to discuss this pretty quickly. The most important thing is keeping our exports cheap, keeping connections with other allies who are especially good at producing these intact. Taiwan is exceptionally good at producing semiconductors. 83% of semiconductors are produced in Taiwan, even though China has a powerful industry there. If we draw closer to Taiwan from a foreign policy standpoint, that should be able to teach China enough of a lesson that this shouldn't need to be a long-term thing, but it will be a quick, short-term solution to simply sign off on some tariffs, get China to back off shortly afterward, and then move to a full free trade system.
Now, I know that implementing a 50% tariff on these semiconductor parts and semiconductors as a whole seems excessive, but when we're looking at forcing China to come to the table, you have to make these things. We just got through a game theory, with this whole idea basically of this prisoner's dilemma. How can we force China to come to the table to talk about this subject? And that's what we're implementing with this, with a 50% tariff on China's semiconductor and semiconductor parts that are used to make semiconductors, while opening up the trade markets to Taiwan, India, Japan, South Korea, those types of countries, to benefit the national security interest of America. And so today we looked at, firstly, the philosophy angle of how we can protect the United States national security while having a good trade system with other nations. And then we looked at the economics of how we can force China to come back into the table. And then lastly, we looked at the policy of it. How are we going to implement this thing? But it leads us back to my elementary school, where we had a system, a trade system of trading for snacks. But when one person messes up that system, it throws the entire thing off. But the end of the story is eventually, after that bully, as we called him, came to the table and started talking to us about this trade system, we were able to have a trade system that involved everyone in the school instead of being forced into a thing where we don't have that comparative advantage that the United States is looking for. Thank you.
All right, thank you. We got time for some questions.
I have one. I like the couching of this in the special interest argument that you made. I'm wondering, when you talk about this will teach China a lesson and bring China to the table, what is the lesson that you intend China to learn? Because it seemed to me like the point of the exercise was to try to get us to not buy as many semiconductors from China. So what's the lesson that we want China to learn?
We want China to practice fair trade practices. So for example, we know that today China is stealing American intellectual property at exorbitant rates. Whether we're talking about discount products from Amazon that you find on Temu or wherever else, these practices are unfair and have robbed the American economy of hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars at this point. So through something like semiconductors, which both the United States and China need for, again, self-interest, national security purposes, we can leverage that to force China to cooperate like every other nation does with intellectual property laws internationally, and force them to come to the table with those issues by using something like that, and ultimately promoting free trade. It's not a protectionist policy, because what you're saying is every other country is doing this and it's benefiting them when we can have this free exchange of these ideas and these goods without these barriers, essentially piracy. And so what we're doing is we're promoting China actually practicing fair policies of fair and free trade with everybody else by using something that is of self-interest to both of them and pressing them on that point.
And hopefully, as a side effect, probably get them to reduce pressure on Taiwan, as we know it's a constant issue just in the global market. Because again, we talked about so much of the semiconductor market or production is still done in Taiwan. So again, if we can back down pressure on them, again, getting them to come to the table and instead practice fair trade practices through the semiconductor industry.
So my question is maybe a little more on the implementation side, because you all mentioned having both export and import tariffs, so I assume on U.S. exports to China and imports from China, and that this could be accomplished by executive order. But under Article 1 of the United States Constitution, export tariffs are strictly forbidden. So do you have the ability, do you think that you would have the ability to pass a constitutional amendment in Congress and through the state houses to actually repeal that provision of the Constitution? Is that your recommendation?
I think yes. When you look at the history of U.S. national security legislation, think about the Patriot Act. I mean, of course that happened in the wake of 9/11, but it's because it's a framing issue. If the U.S. can properly frame the China issue with how it is in reality, which is competition with a competitor which desires to at least supplant the U.S. as the leader of the global international order, I think you would receive buy-in from both sides of the aisle, because opposition to China is a bipartisan issue. You have a China commission right now in Congress that is chaired by Democrats and Republicans as the chair and the co-chair. So it's an issue that everyone agrees is one that should consume both parties, that transcends the political separation that we see in our country today. And so it's one of those things where you find support from Congress by framing the issue in the right way. And you're right, it is an issue that belongs to Congress, to the legislature, and you would find support again by framing the issue correctly.
And even if we couldn't personally get those export tariffs, then the goal would be for our Southeast Asian allies who have less strict laws on those import and export tariffs to be able to do that, so that they would have the more, because a lot of the leverage is going to come from universal agreement to sort of ice China out. So even if we can only allow foreign import tariffs, we can hedge our bets with the other nations that will come to help us as well, help us in this as well.
All right.